What I'm about to tell you may shock you. Modern marriage, sold as the ultimate symbol of love and partnership, often works as one of the most sophisticated systems of male domestication. While he believes he's living the happily ever after, he is actually giving up freedom, identity, and vitality in exchange for a relationship where female psychology quietly assumes the role of control. Society, media, and religion applaud this arrangement, turning sacrifice into virtue without ever revealing the silent price men pay. And before we continue, I'll ask you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It's not vanity. It's because this kind of content rarely shows up in your feed. There's an entire system that profits when you stay in the dark about these truths. So, if you value your freedom and want to see beyond the illusion, make sure you don't miss the next chapters of this reflection. A man's life. After saying "I do," when a man enters marriage, he often doesn't realize the silent change that starts creeping into his routine. Those spontaneous hangouts with friends grow rare until they nearly vanish, and the hobbies that once gave him joy start being seen as selfish whims. Free time, once a sacred space for personal choices, dissolves into bills, family obligations, and constant adjustments to keep the relationship in harmony. Even money, once solely his, takes on the weight of hours, where female psychology usually assumes control of management. This transformation doesn't happen abruptly, but in small doses, like drops falling on the same spot until they carve stone. Independence, once treasured in youth, slowly fragments, leaving the man feeling trapped in an invisible prison. It's as if he unknowingly trades his freedom for a preset social role. Here's the curious part. Many men believe they're just adjusting to a new stage of the relationship, when in fact they are being slowly conditioned to live inside a new psychological mold. Take the simple act of going out with friends to watch a game. Before, it took only a quick call. After marriage, the decision must go through justifications and negotiations. What once was natural now feels like a granted favor. The man adapts to this dynamic, thinking it's part of adult life, but hardly notices he's giving up pieces of autonomy. And this gradual loss of freedom is only the first step in a much more elaborate process: the invisible engineering of marriage. The invisible engineering of marriage. There's an almost ironic detail in marriage. What makes a man a good partner, being a provider, dedicated, and responsible, is exactly what turns into his chains. Female psychology instinctively knows that the more a man takes on the support role, the more tied he becomes to the relationship. He believes he's honoring noble values, but in practice he's cooperating with his own emotional and financial captivity. It's as if masculine virtues were turned into golden handcuffs. Resisting this process rarely feels like an option. If a man sets boundaries, he's quickly labeled selfish, insensitive, or immature. So, to avoid conflict and prove his love, he yields. This pattern of concessions builds an invisible engineering inside marriage, where the woman adjusts the rules of the game and the man learns to play on hostile ground. It's not conscious manipulation, but a survival mechanism society has normalized as natural, and even romantic. Think about how many men sacrifice professional opportunities because their wife doesn't like the city where the promotion would take them, or how many work double shifts to sustain the couple's lifestyle. They believe they're doing it out of love, but in reality, they're digging the hole that locks them into the provider role. And what's most striking is that this engineering isn't only about conjugal dynamics, but also about the cultural indoctrination upholding the happily ever after myth. The cultural indoctrination of happily ever after, more provocative, version. Happy wife, happy life. This seemingly harmless phrase works like a cultural virus planted in the male mind. It teaches men to always put female psychology and her needs above their own, as if marriage were an arena where only one side deserves satisfaction. It's almost training for voluntary servitude. From early on, he learns that his peace depends solely on her mood. Without realizing it, he accepts living as a permanent firefighter, putting out emotional fires at home. The result? A grotesque imbalance. Male happiness is treated as disposable, while hers becomes the absolute priority. If she smiles, the relationship is saved. If she cries, he has failed. That isn't love. it's conditioning. Worse still, men reinforce this myth, among themselves repeating empty advice like, "Make her happy and your life will be smooth." Smooth for whom? For him, who becomes a ghost in his own marriage, or for her, who gets to dictate the climate of the relationship without consequences? Examples abound. Men rushing to buy gifts when their wife gets upset, as if trying to bribe peace back into the house. Others who work endless shifts to fund whims, thinking it proves their love. But when it's the man who crumbles, the system says, "Man up, shut up, endure." This indoctrination doesn't just drain his vitality, it paves the way for identity erosion, the next stage of marital engineering, turning the man into an accessory in his own marriage. The gradual erosion of identity. Over time, marriage acts like a river wearing down a rock's edges. Solitude and independence, once familiar, are replaced by a life shaped to her taste. It doesn't happen through big sudden changes, but through small daily adjustments that seem harmless. A dinner where the restaurant isn't the one he wanted. A trip where his preferred destination is discarded. A shirt he stops wearing because she doesn't like it. Bits of identity slip away like sand through fingers. These accumulated concessions pile up like grains on a scale, becoming unbearable. At first, he believes yielding keeps harmony. Years later, he realizes he has lost his agency. He no longer decides out of desire but out of habit to avoid conflict. The we of marriage swallows the individual I, and what once looked like companionship becomes the erasure of male personality. Picture the man who once played guitar on weekends but whose instrument now gathers dust in a closet, forgotten, because there's always something more important to do. Or the man who dreamed of starting a business but settled for a stable job because change seemed too risky for married life. Slowly, his life becomes an extension of her desires, leaving only a shadow of who he once was. The before and after of female conquest. During dating, a man lives in an enchanting script. Passionate nights, constant smiles, and shared interests that feel almost magical. The energy of the relationship pulses as if each meeting were a promise of eternity. Driven by the instinct of conquest, the woman shows her most seductive and charming side. He believes he's found unconditional love, when in truth he has stepped into an ancient game dictated by female psychology, which prioritizes the seduction phase as an attraction strategy. After marriage, the scene changes almost imperceptibly. Physical intimacy, once abundant, is now offered more selectively, often as a reward for good behavior. Warmth gives way to growing demands, and shared interests start to fade, replaced by routines and responsibilities. The man, who once felt he had a vibrant partner, now faces a figure who measures each gesture by how useful he is in the relationship. This shift isn't born from coldness, but from an evolutionary pattern. Marriage, within the quiet logic of female psychology, becomes the stage where she seeks stability and resources. She tones down her seductive intensity and amplifies her demands. The man, without noticing, falls into an emotional trap. He feels compelled to give more and more to receive less and less. In this unequal exchange, he begins to see that her love seems conditioned, not to who he is, but to what he provides. Love conditioned by usefulness. In modern marriage, female affection often ties directly to the man's utility, as long as he delivers stability, security, and resources. The relationship seems to function. But when the cost-benefit changes, the balance collapses. It's no coincidence that 70–80% of divorces are initiated by women, revealing that, for many, commitment lasts only as long as the return is worthwhile. Even after separation, the man remains bound, now through the court system, financially sustaining someone who no longer shares his life. This arrangement reveals an uncomfortable truth. The so-called eternal love shows itself conditional. The man realizes that his presence is valued not for his essence, but for what he offers. And in this process, he discovers that even when the relationship ends, the economic prison persists, keeping him tied to a contract that drains his resources and energy. What was once supposed to be a pact of companionship is, in practice, a relationship of usefulness disguised as love. 7. Emotional prison and the adaptation syndrome. Over time, the man begins to live in reactive mode, constantly putting out emotional fires within the marriage. He finds himself carrying tensions, anxieties, and frustrations that aren't just his butt also hers. This cycle trains him to absorb the weight of everything until he develops a kind of learned helplessness, believing there is no alternative but to adapt. Female psychology, even without conscious intent, reinforces this by creating scenarios where he feels indispensable only as long as he serves. This endless adaptation generates something like a domestic Stockholm syndrome. The man defends the very system that oppresses him. He convinces himself he should be grateful for having a relationship, even if that relationship drains him. He starts justifying behaviors, downplaying pain, silencing revolt. And in that silence, he molds himself more and more into the role of an emotional prisoner, accepting routine as if it were inevitable. How society sustains the myth, the social machine works like an echo, repeating the same message. Sacrifice equals love. Movies, soap operas, songs, and even sermons reinforce the idea that a man must give endlessly to keep marriage alive. This cultural programming legitimizes the abandonment of male identity, dressing it up as virtue. Female psychology thrives in this environment, since women are constantly reminded of their right to demand more, while men are taught their role is to give in. To avoid facing their own sense of defeat, many married men reinforce the myth among themselves. They repeat lines like, "Marriage is partnership," or "Everyone goes through this," not out of conviction, but to justify their own choices. Admitting they gave up their psychological freedom would be too painful. And so, the wheel spins. Culture sustains the unequal relationship, and men themselves become propagators of their own domestication. The hidden biological logic of the marital game, at its core, female behavior follows predictable patterns shaped by biology. Marriage, far from being pure romance, is an evolutionary leverage strategy. Whoever has more options holds more power in the relationship. Female psychology, unconsciously, operates on this board by maximizing resources and security. Meanwhile, the man, by tying himself exclusively to one bond, loses bargaining power and becomes subordinate to the rules of the game. This imbalance explains why so many men feel marriage puts them at a disadvantage. While they believe they're living a pact of unconditional love, they're actually inside a dynamic where their usefulness defines their value. The man who preserves alternatives and independence also preserves respect and attraction. The one who gives up everything and anchors his identity solely in the relationship inevitably loses power. The fatal error of external validation. The great mistake of many men is seeking happiness and validation exclusively from their wife. When he starts believing his identity depends on her recognition, he becomes someone molded only to please. At that point, no matter how hard he tries, as soon as he becomes indispensable to her lifestyle, he is seen as personally replaceable. The relationship, instead of a source of fulfillment, becomes a distorted mirror where he only sees value when she approves. This pattern creates a vicious cycle. The more he tries to prove his love, the more he erases himself. And the more he erases himself, the less respect he earns. Female psychology instinctively responds to this fragility by decreasing desire and admiration. The man then lives in desperate search of proof that he's still loved, when in practice he has already lost the core of the relationship. And in that silent emptiness lies the real price of marriage. The silent price of the arrangement. Marriage exacts a heavy price that's rarely spoken aloud. Married men show higher rates of depression, anxiety, and loss of vitality over the years. The weight of responsibility, combined with constant emotional strain, reduces quality of life and even life expectancy. Female psychology, in demanding stability and support, extracts from the man a continuous energy that slowly drains both his body and mind. This invisible sacrifice isn't only personal, but also economic. The system relies on this silent surrender. Men who work more, consume less for themselves, and sustain structures that don't fully benefit them. They carry the burden believing they're doing it for love, without realizing society at large profits from their submission. In the end, modern marriage looks less like a balanced partnership and more like an arrangement where the real cost is paid with the man's very life. The philosophy of self-sufficiency. True male freedom begins when he realizes his happiness cannot depend on anyone but himself. Marriage, contrary to cultural preaching, should not be seen as some transcendence of love, but as a contract between two parties. This shift in perspective shatters the illusion that giving everything is a virtue, revealing that self-sufficiency is the only solid foundation. A man who builds himself upon his own emotional strength doesn't become insensitive. He becomes sovereign over his life. From this point, the relationship ceases to be a prison and becomes a choice. A man with purpose, mission, and independence doesn't fear loss because he knows his identity isn't at stake. He can share, love, and even marry, but he never dissolves into the other. The secret is simple. When he no longer needs external validation, he keeps his essence intact. And it's precisely that posture which sustains the true dynamics of attraction. The true dynamics of attraction, female psychology instinctively responds to strength, independence, and scarcity. A man who sets clear boundaries, follows his mission, and doesn't bend to every whim preserves respect and desire within the relationship. Meanwhile, the so-called nice guys, always available and quick to validate every action of their partner, lose ground because their predictability kills the natural tension that sustains attraction. Marriage, when lived this way, becomes a stage of veiled disrespect. The dynamic is simple. The less he revolves his life around her, the more invested she remains. Moderate absence breeds interest. Independence creates magnetism. On the other hand, when a man places his entire identity inside the relationship, he not only loses power, but also extinguishes the very spark that once ignited her desire. The balance lies in staying strategic, not to manipulate, but to avoid disappearing within the relationship. The journey of male sovereignty. Being strong doesn't mean being cruel, just as independence isn't the same as indifference. The sovereign man learns to love without losing himself, to be generous without becoming exploited. This posture grows from understanding that true dignity lies in never bargaining away one's essence. When he sustains himself emotionally, he no longer begs for approval, but enters the relationship as a complete partner, not a dependent. This journey requires him to kill the part of himself that craves external validation. It's a symbolic death. Abandoning the old pattern of pleasing at any cost to be reborn with purpose and firmness. Only then can he walk freely, without fear of rejection or loss. From this position, he doesn't chase love. Love finds in him a space of respect. And that turning point decides whether life is lived in servitude or in freedom. The turning point. Servitude or freedom. The system of modern marriage survives by convincing men that sacrifice is proof of love. This idea, repeated like a cultural mantra, makes many accept psychological servitude, believing they're living a noble relationship. But the truth is that real love doesn't imprison, it expands. The man who wakes up to this sees that the choice isn't about being a good or bad partner, but about either allowing himself to be domesticated or preserving his sovereignty. The turning point comes when he realizes that nothing external can complete what can only be built within. From that moment, marriage stops being a sentence and becomes just one of life's possibilities. The free man doesn't run from love, but he also doesn't make it a condition for existence. He decides whether to remain chained to a cultural myth that consumes him, or to claim the freedom of living fully, regardless of any relationship. So tell me, how long will you accept this game in silence? Modern marriage sells love but often delivers servitude. Will you stay trapped in this myth or choose freedom? If this video made you think differently, subscribe now, like it, and turn on notifications. Each new video could be the key that stops you from ever being manipulated by the same system that traps so many men.